Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Before I worked at the Battleship, though, I worked for Historic Ships in Baltimore, and for the 4 years before coming up to Camden, New Jersey, I was the site manager for the Coast Guard cutter Taney. Now, today is a day that should be a national holiday. It's 327 Day, March 27th. The 327s were a class of 7 Coast Guard cutters designed and built during the Great Depression as part of the nation's effort to pull itself out of the Depression. It was part of Roosevelt's strategy to put Americans back to work. So from the moment they started designing these ships, they were already serving their country. The ships would be built around the country, with 4 of them built in Dry Dock Number 3 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where Battleship New Jersey would be built a couple years later. The other ones were built in Charleston and New York. All 3 were built at Navy yards, and they were built from a Navy gunboat design that had come out as a result of the London Naval Treaties. So for more information on the naval treaties, check the description down below. But it limited unclassified warships to a speed of 20 knots, guns no greater than 6 inches, and they were not allowed to carry torpedoes. So the Navy thought this would be a great way to supplement its fleet with escorts. They built 2 of these ships, Erie and Charleston, and then the treaty system fell apart. The Coast Guard was also trying to design a large class of cutter as it came out of the Prohibition era. So they were looking for new jobs to keep the Coast Guard relevant. So they needed a vessel that could operate in the open ocean, and they figured correctly that the next area of maritime concern would be protecting aviation. So around the same time period, Pan American Airways starts operating clippers across the open ocean. So this is some of the first commercial air traffic that is going transcontinental and transoceanic. So they were worried that if one of these brand new airplanes, remember airplanes at this point are only some 30 years old, if one of these aircraft goes down in the open ocean, how do we save them? Well, if the Coast Guard is operating large ocean-going vessels, they can station them on these air routes, and if there's an emergency, the cutters can make it there in time to rescue them. And in the initial design and deployment of these vessels, they carried aircraft of their own, because the Coast Guard, again, rightly deduced that aircraft were the way to do search and rescue going into the future. As it turns out, the aircraft they embarked were float planes, and the cutters were not large enough to have a hangar for these float planes. So the float planes were fine. You could use the cutter's crane to put them into and out of the water, and that would, the plane could take off and land in the water. The problem was, when the engine was running, it got very hot, and when the plane tried to land in the water, cold water would splash on the engine and often cause cracked cylinders, those sorts of issues. So without a hangar to be able to repair significant damage to the engine, it just wasn't a very functional design. It was a little bit ahead of its time. Coast Guard cutters today, the large ocean-going ones, all carry aircraft, and they use them well for search and rescue. It's just that they use helicopters that can land and take off from the cutter, as opposed to float planes, which have since gone out of style. So these cutters are built and they're distributed around the country, and the Coast Guard doesn't just guard the coast of America, they guard wherever there are Americans. So that means you can deploy these cutters overseas to our colonies, say Hawaii, which was not a state yet at that time, but was where Taney was home ported, or the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, where there's a lot of fishing going on in really rough weather. The large ocean-going cutters proved very capable of that. And off of the coast of Greenland, which, as World War II starts up and the Danish government, Norway, and the other Scandinavian countries that had been administering Greenland and Iceland are overrun by the Nazis, these countries need to be defended. And Great Britain didn't really have the resources to do that, so one of the early Lend-Lease agreements between the two countries was that the United States would take over defense of Greenland. So the Coast Guard played a very important role in that. And some of the work that they did up there would play a big part in later convoy actions, in which the Coast Guard also played a large role in. So these cutters, with their low speed and lack of torpedo armament, although big and open ocean going capabilities, proved to be not effective at guarding Navy ships, but they were great convoy escorts. They had the fuel capacity to take convoys all the way across the ocean. They had the ability to do so in rough weather, and they had the capacity to carry large numbers of depth charges and good underwater detection equipment like sonar. And they were large enough that they could have a flag officer on board to coordinate the entire defense of the convoy. So oftentimes 327 class cutters were used as flagships. So I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself. The 7 327 class cutters are the Alexander Hamilton, which we'll talk about a little bit later. She's the only one of the class that's lost during World War II. You have the Spencer, which was decommissioned in the 1970s, about 40 years after she was built. You have the Duane and the Bib, which are both decommissioned in the early 80s and are sunk as artificial reefs, so you can go and visit them off the coast of Florida. You have the Campbell, which was sunk in missile tests. She was actually probably sunk by a Harpoon cruise missile fired by the recently reactivated battleship New Jersey when she was testing that new weapon system in the early 1980s. So there's another connection between New Jersey and the 327 class cutters besides where they were built. Then there is the Coast Guard cutter Ingham, which is sunk in, she's not sunk, she's open as a museum in Key West, Florida. And I don't believe she's open right now because of the coronavirus, but if you ever go down there on vacation, be sure to check her out. And there's also the Coast Guard cutter Taney, which is in Baltimore's Inner Harbor, and which is also currently closed for the coronavirus, but will reopen afterwards. So these cutters operated all around the world during World War II, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific. Taney participated in the defense of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. She was operating with Destroyer Division 80, which was not part of the battle force of the Pacific Fleet, but was part of the anti-submarine force protecting the Hawaiian Islands. So she was getting ready to go out and relieve USS Ward when Ward radioed that there was a submarine spotted and fired upon in the channel entrance. When that happened, Taney went to general quarters, although she didn't receive orders to get to sea. And then the Japanese attack came over, and Taney was one of the few ships immediately ready to provide defense. And she's credited with engaging multiple flights of Japanese planes throughout the morning and with defending the Honolulu power plant, which was right next to where she was docked at the time. And this saved electrical power for the city of Honolulu, including the hospitals there, which were helping the Americans who were wounded in the attack. So she spent much of the early war doing convoy escort duty in the Pacific. Her 6 sister ships were all in the Atlantic by this point. Before the United States even entered the war, the 327 class cutters and later the entire Coast Guard was made a subset of the Navy. So they were absorbed into the Navy in much the same way that the Marine Corps was, in that if you serve in the Marine Corps, or the Coast Guard in this instance, you're still a member of the Marine Corps or Coast Guardsman. You're not actually a Navy sailor. You tend to be stationed to your own units. You're not taken from a Coast Guard cutter and deployed on a Navy ship with a Navy crew. However, they still operated under the Secretary of the Navy. So these cutters were repositioned going into the war, and when the war started, they were all operating with Navy destroyer squadrons, doing escort work. Alexander Hamilton was the first American warship lost following the attack on Pearl Harbor. She was towing a damaged merchant vessel into Iceland at the time, trying to get them to Reykjavik, and just as she cast off her tow for an ocean-going tug to take over, a U-boat was able to torpedo her, and it caused the loss of the cutter. So she was the only one lost and the only cutter in the class that didn't see 40 or more years of service. The cutters in the Atlantic provided flagships for the Atlantic convoy runs across the North Atlantic during the Bloody Winter, so one of the most dangerous periods. And amazingly, between the 5 cutters operating there, they were able to sink 3 U-boats. Not only did they sink those U-boats, but they were able to sink them in a way that provided proof that they were sunk. So these are actually very well documented sinkings of these vessels. The 327 class actually has one of the highest kill ratios of U-boats, if not the highest, of any class of warships ever produced. Between the 7 cutters, they managed to sink 3 U-boats for the loss of a single vessel. The purpose-built destroyer escorts that came out later in the war, specifically for this function, sunk a much lower percentage of boats, as did the Navy craft operating alongside the Coast Guard cutter during this time period. So as the war goes on and the Coast Guard cutters are replaced in the North Atlantic by purpose-built escorts, they transition into the Mediterranean convoy runs as we invade North Africa, and then they're converted into amphibious flagships to lead amphibious invasions. So the invasion of southern France, the invasion of some of the Philippine Islands, and eventually the invasion of Okinawa. But this was done because the cutters were large and capable of taking the additional radios that were required to coordinate this, and because Coast Guardsmen were the ones driving the amphibious craft onto the beaches. So because a lot of the amphibious stuff was being done by the Coast Guard already, it was thought appropriate that Coast Guard cutters could make good flagships for this, and they certainly did at that. At the end of the war, Taney was the first Coast Guard cutter to enter the Japanese home islands, and she took part in some of the occupation of Japan before taking part in Operation Magic Carpet and bringing American servicemen back home. This parallels the battleship New Jersey's involvement at the end of the war as well. The major difference between a 327 class cutter and the battleship New Jersey is their length of service, not necessarily their time in service, because they served roughly the same period. The 327s were in commission from 1936 all the way up until 1988, and the Iowa-class battleships were in service from 1943 all the way up until 1992. So there's a lot of overlap there, but the major difference is when there's peacetime, battleships like New Jersey are decommissioned. They're too expensive. Their only roles happen in wartime. When there's peacetime, the Coast Guard cutters go back to doing the mission they were designed to do. So in the case of these cutters, it was law enforcement, it was search and rescue, and it was drug interdiction. Then when the shooting starts again, they go and participate in the war again. So these cutters fought in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and then the war on drugs in the 1980s. Whereas the Iowa-class battleships fought in World War II and then were decommissioned. Came back for Korea, were decommissioned again. One came back for Vietnam, New Jersey, and was immediately decommissioned, while the cutters all served at least one tour off Vietnam, providing the same type of gunfire support that the battleship was providing. And then decommissioned again, brought back for the Cold War in the 1980s, before being decommissioned after the fall of the Berlin Wall for the last time. So the Coast Guard cutters saw between 40 and 50 years of service, while the Iowa-class battleships saw between 10 and 20 years of service over the course of the same 50-year period. It is interesting to tour the two vessels, say take New Jersey and Taney, because they're only about 90 minutes apart. If you were to tour the two vessels, you're seeing similar styles of construction built at the same place at roughly the same time. And you're seeing old 1930s designed vessels that get all sorts of modern 1980s technology grafted on over the years. So you see technology from an entire half century of American naval history on the two ships. And it's a lot of the same stuff. So it's very interesting walking through one and going through another, because outwardly they're very different. So here in 1/700 scale is the battleship New Jersey, and here in the same scale is the Coast Guard cutter Taney, about a third the length and width, and her displacement of 2,700 tons is only a little bit more than one of the 16-inch gun turrets on the battleship. So, some of the stuff that the Coast Guard was doing with these ships after the World War II period, they, of course, fought during the Korean War. They went back to doing aircraft guard duty at that time. And then they started doing what was called ocean weather stations. So nowadays we use satellites and radars to determine what storms are going to hit us from far away. Before we had a bunch of weather satellites out there, the easiest way to do this was to take a bunch of Coast Guard cutters, put them in the middle of the ocean, and then when they got hit by storms, they could radio that back in. It's boring work in theory, but on the plus side, if there's any sort of emergency at sea, some other vessel, some aircraft, like these cutters were designed to do, goes down, there's cutters already stationed around the oceans that can get there and rescue them. And this happened a number of times during the lives of these ships. So by the 1980s, these cutters, which were designed to last just 20 years, were crossing the half-century mark, but they were still doing the same job they were designed to do in the 1930s. Search and rescue, law enforcement, and drug interdiction. In the case of the remaining 327s at this point, they were doing that work mostly in the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. And then finally, like I said, after half a century of service, the Coast Guard was able to get funding from the Reagan administration to be able to build newer cutters that were able to carry helicopters and modern equipment to replace the 327s. Like I said, 2 were preserved as museums, 2 were sunk as artificial reefs, and you can visit those 2 as well. 1 was sunk as a test, 1 had been sunk during the war, and just 1 of them was cut up as razor blades. So if you're interested in learning more about this unique and underrepresented class of ships, here's a couple of books you can go to. We have Bob Kettenheim's Coast Guard cutter Taney, which is available for sale at the Battleship store. If you check the link in the description, you'll be able to see this product. Bloodstained Sea by Walling tells the story of these ships specifically during World War II in the Atlantic. One of my favorites, though, is completely out of print these days. Sinbad of the Coast Guard. Believe it or not, this book about the ship's dog on the 327 class cutter Campbell was the first biography ever written about a Coast Guardsman. The oldest branch of service in the military, and this was the first book written about one of its members. It was about a dog, and it wasn't released until 1945. There's also a movie, Sinbad of the Coast Guard, which is a 1940s type propaganda movie. It's about 20 minutes long. You can find that sometimes online. And of course, if you like the romance story Pearl Harbor, Whispers of a New Dawn is basically the same plot, but Taney makes an appearance. If you want to learn more about ocean weather stations, Adam's book, Open Ocean Stations, features a great picture of Taney on the back of the cover and tells that story of a unique time in the Coast Guard. So I would be remiss in telling the story of 327 class cutters if I didn't tell you the story of some of the longest served crew members of those cutters. The Coast Guard cutter Campbell had the most famous of these, their ship's dog Sinbad, who was on board for 11 years. We'll talk about him more later, but Taney also had a ship's dog on board from about 1937 when she arrived in Hawaii until 1948 after World War II ended. Her name was Mary Sugi. She was a bosun's mate. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, she bravely manned her general quarters station underneath one of the refrigerators in the galley and threatened to bark at any enemies who came near the refrigerator. During Taney's convoy runs in the Atlantic, Sugi is seen in a number of pictures of the ship in that configuration. And during her time off Okinawa, she is again seen with the crew. Following the war, at the age of 11 or 12, she retired with a departing chief petty officer and lived out the rest of her days, probably somewhere around the San Francisco area. So, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Check back in every day for more content on this and our other social media sites. And be sure to like this video if you like content about other museum ships, or leave a comment in the description about whether you like this type of content or not. Since we are closed and creating content every day, we're trying to come up with different topics to give you. So this is an experiment since today is the national holiday 327 Day, where we remember the 327 class cutters. Remember, if you would like to support the ship, there are links in the description down below to either donate or check out our ship store. And you'll see me again tomorrow.